about information and delivery. And you can see that our region goes, we can head all the way up through some of those Canadian provinces, but all that little gray area, the urban area, shows you that we also have a lot of wildland-urban interface, and so that's one of our particular challenges in our region. This is our leadership team. We have Nick Skoronsky, Aaron Lane from the U.S. Forest Service, Amanda Mahaffey from the Forest Stewards Guild, and myself as the Science Communications Director. We have a great group of community representatives from all walks of life, all who have a great interest in fire science in the Northeast, and give us a good idea of what's happening in our communities across the region. What do? Well, we communicate science through field trips, workshops, webinars, research briefs, newsletters, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one of our methods of doing so. So here's our main field trip pictures from celebrating the 70th year anniversary of the Great Acadia Fire. So that was one of our events we held last fall. We have capstone workshops. This one was on fire and fuel monitoring up in Albany Pine Bush. Very, very productive workshop. And then we just recently held the Igniting Exchange meeting up with the Northeast Forest Fire Protection Compact. So we had a really great partnership with them and some amazing presentations, many of which are on our YouTube channel or on our website. So here's an example of some of the webinars we have on our website, and we will put this one on there as well. Coming up, we have, after this webinar, we have a CERDIP webinar series. So you can see this is a huge project in New Jersey and the Pinelands, and so all of those bullet points there are going to have their own webinar. So it's going to be kind of fast and furious, giving you all aspects of this project. So that's kind of our next series of webinars that we're going to have. It's a very, very interesting and detailed project in the New Jersey Pinelands, kind of looking at fire behavior from all angles. We have research briefs, and those are what I'm responsible for. And so we take scientific paper and we sort of summarize it and give you the management implications in language that everyone can understand. We have newsletters, and if you haven't signed up for our newsletters, those are a really great way to keep up to date on what's going on. Obviously, social media, Facebook, Twitter. So those are regularly updated with stuff that's relevant to our region. And then if you forget all of that, everything is on our website, which is firesciencenorthatlantic.org. So with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce Elizabeth Gleim, or Liz Gleim. And she has luckily graced us with her presentation today, and we're very excited because it's such a relevant topic. So Elizabeth Gleim received her biology from Hollins University at Roanoke, Virginia. So prior to graduate school, she worked for almost 2 years at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, in the Division of Parasitic Diseases. Liz went on to receive her PhD in wildlife ecology and management with a focus in wildlife disease ecology from the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Diseases at the University of Georgia. Liz was housed within the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study at UGA, where her research focused on the impacts of long-term prescribed fire on tick populations and the tick-borne disease risks. To complete this work, she spent approximately 2.5 years doing field work in southwestern Georgia, where she was based out of the Joseph Jones Ecological Research Center. Liz is now an assistant professor of biology and environmental studies back at Hollins University in Roanoke, Virginia, where she continues to study the tick-borne disease ecology. And so we're very, very excited to have Liz today to give her presentation. And take it away, Liz.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to share a little bit about the research that I did, and this will primarily focus on the research that I did during my graduate work at UGA, looking at the impacts of prescribed fire on tick populations and disease risk. Okay, so there are actually 4 different tick species that occur in the eastern United States that are of human public health relevance, meaning these are the tick species that you may actually find on yourself. The most common tick is actually the Lone Star tick there, right here on your left-hand side. These are incredibly common in southeastern U.S. and of course have over the past maybe 10 to 20 years made their way further and further into the northeastern United States. We also have the Gulf Coast tick, which is actually not particularly common even in the areas that it does occur. As the name might imply, it actually is primarily restricted to the southeastern U.S. along the coastal plain. But I chose to go ahead and mention it even to my northeastern folks just because it ended up being a tick species that was of particular relevance in my research in Georgia. And if you should happen to be, say, in the areas of Virginia or Maryland, you may still come into contact with this particular tick species. We also have the American dog tick. And then, of course, the tick that everybody knows, which is the black-legged tick, which most folks call the deer tick. There's actually several different species of Ixodes. Ixodes scapularis is the black-legged tick, and then there are a couple other species that play important roles in maintaining the causative agent of Lyme disease in the wild. And what's important to know about these different tick species is each species is capable of vectoring specific pathogens that can cause diseases in humans. So, for example, the Lone Star tick is capable of vectoring agents that cause various types of ehrlichiosis, as well as the southern tick-associated rash illness. Our Gulf Coast ticks vector the causative agent of Rickettsia parkii rickettsiosis. American dog ticks, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and of course, our black-legged ticks are associated with Lyme disease, human granulocytic anaplasmosis, as well as babesiosis. And it turns out that both the incidence as well as the emergence of new tick-borne diseases has increased dramatically in the past several decades. And we really have seen this across the board. We've seen that with Lyme disease, which you can see here in this particular figure. We've seen that with Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which we can see here in this graph. And really we've seen this across the board with most tick-borne diseases. And so, of course, the big question is why? Why are we seeing this dramatic increase? And really at the top of the list is thought to be land modification. So as humans are encroaching upon wildlife habitat, that also is, of course, ideal tick habitat. So humans are simply coming into contact with ticks more frequently. We're also seeing increases in host abundance, which oftentimes is, again, linked to human land modification. So, for example, we, of course, know that deer populations have exploded for the past several decades. Deer, of course, are very important hosts for ticks. We've also seen increases in other hosts, such as turkeys, coyotes, raccoons. These are all really important wildlife hosts for ticks. So it sort of goes without saying that as we see increases in these host populations, we also expect to see increases in tick populations. So there seem to be more ticks. The other thing that's thought to be perhaps maybe a smaller player in the scheme of things is climate change. So as we are seeing warmer temperatures, particularly here in the U.S. and in the northeastern U.S., we are seeing ticks expand their ranges into areas that historically they had not been able to live in. So we certainly are seeing, for example, Lone Star ticks moving northward, as well as black-legged ticks. So as we see this increase in incidence and emergence of tick-borne diseases, of course, the need to try to identify ways to mitigate disease risk and control tick populations, of course, has been an important topic of conversation. And one of the proposed solutions has been fire. And it turns out there have actually been a number of studies looking at the impacts of fire on ticks. And out of those studies, most studies agree that tick populations are reduced immediately after fire. So yes, fire does indeed kill ticks. Most studies, however, found that tick populations recover to some degree after the fire. But where the dispute really seems to come into play is what are the long-term effects of prescribed fire on tick abundance? Unfortunately, a lot of the previous studies have had conflicting results. So some studies have actually, somewhat surprisingly, found increases in tick populations after a fire, talking long-term. Others have found decreases in tick populations, and yet others have found that the tick populations were initially knocked back but just returned to pre-burn levels within a period of time. So as myself and my colleagues were sort of thinking about the project that we wanted to put together, our big question was, why are we seeing these discrepancies in the literature? And what we generally found was sort of two different things. We found that a lot of other studies had failed to account for other variables known to affect tick populations. So other variables might include things like wildlife host abundance or vegetation structure, weather, etc. And or the past studies had not simulated real-world management practices. And by that I mean that oftentimes in an effort to be controlled, these past studies were done on small pieces of land, maybe only, say, 1 to 10 acres, and or they were burning an area that had never been burned before, and they just did a single burn, and that was it. And that's, of course, in direct contrast to what we see in real-world management scenarios, where prescribed fires are typically occurring on hundreds, if not thousands of acres, and they're occurring on a regular basis. And those differences in study design have direct implications for the ability of tick populations to be able to recolonize and repopulate an area, right? It's a lot easier to recolonize a small piece of area that's only been burned once than it would be to recolonize several hundred acres that's getting burned on a regular basis. So with that, we put together the project that I did for my dissertation, which happened down in southwestern Georgia. And the hope was that through that research, we would determine tick abundance and seasonality in that region. It just so happened that was a region of Georgia where there was little to no tick data to begin with, so even just that basic information was quite helpful. And then we also, of course, wanted to determine tick-borne pathogen prevalence there as well. And then, of course, the big money question was to determine the effects of long-term prescribed burning on tick abundance and pathogen prevalence. Okay, so with that, we basically set up the project. We had 21 total sites in southwestern Georgia, which you can, oops, that's not what I meant to do, sorry, which you can see right here in the bottom right-hand side. That was the region of Georgia I was working in. And we chose to put the 21 sites into 4 different categories in an effort to sort of take more of a landscape level approach and to account for what was happening not only in the sites that I was working in, but in the areas immediately surrounding those sites as far as burning was concerned. So the 4 categories that we placed sites into were burned sites surrounded by burned areas, so sort of burn utopias, if you will. The other category was burned sites surrounded by unburned areas, and then, of course, the vice versa, that unburned surrounded by burned. And then finally, we had 3 different control sites that were unburned surrounded by unburned, so again, a control. One thing that I think that's important to note here is, as I mentioned before, we were wanting to look at sites that had been subjected to long-term prescribed burning. And so because of that, we wanted to make sure that if we were categorizing something as burned, that it had been burned for a minimum of 10 years. And if we were categorizing something as unburned, it had been unburned for 10 years. So that was the criteria. It had to be at least 10 years of whatever it was, burned or unburned. But in many cases, these sites had been subjected to burning for decades. Okay, so what did I do? Basically, we performed field work for 2 years straight, and during those 2 years, we did monthly tick surveys, so collected ticks from all 21 sites on a monthly basis. And then we also, at the time of sampling for ticks, we also took microclimatic and weather data. And then on a quarterly basis, we did vegetation surveys and host surveys via trail camera surveys. In terms of the prescribed burnings that were happening in the sites, we basically just asked the land managers of the sites to just carry on and do whatever they would normally do. So for them, what that meant was that they were doing dormant season burns. For some of our locations that were located at Itchaway, those sites were being burned every 2 years. And for all of our wildlife management areas, those were typically being burned on a 2 to 4 year rotation. And it just so happened, coincidentally, that all my sites that were at WMAs were burned during the study period. So after 2 years of collecting ticks, I managed to get just a few. As you can see there, I got just over 47,000 ticks. Of those, the Lone Star tick was by far the most abundant tick species, and that's really what we expected. The second most common tick was the black-legged tick. And somewhat surprisingly, the third most common tick for us was the Gulf Coast tick. And as I mentioned before, the Gulf Coast tick, it certainly happens in the coastal plain there in southwestern Georgia, but it's not a particularly abundant tick, even in its most ideal habitat. So we were kind of surprised that we were capturing it in the numbers that we were, and sort of pleasantly surprised because not a lot was known about the life history of this tick because it is so hard to find. So that was sort of a pleasant surprise for us in a nerdy kind of tick biologist way. And then we also got a small handful of American dog ticks. Okay, so the big money question of does long-term prescribed fire reduce tick populations? And the answer is a resounding yes, it does reduce tick populations. So what you can see here is in the solid black there, that was our control site, or our control sites. Those were the areas that were unburned. And as you can see, the ticks were alive and well at those particular sites, showing normal seasonality as we would expect. However, if we look at all of our other burn treatments, you can see that they absolutely flatlined. So regardless of burn treatment, it really just appeared that the ticks weren't there. And what was particularly interesting to us was most other studies had found that tick populations were knocked back after a fire and then recovered to some level after the fire. But what we were really surprised to see was that the ticks just simply weren't there. So it wasn't that they were getting knocked back and then resurging, but just that for some reason they didn't seem to be at those sites. So that was very interesting to us, and I'll pick up a little bit more on that in just a moment. So as I mentioned before, one thing that we really wanted to do was to account for other variables that we knew could impact tick abundance and presence. So as I mentioned, we collected data on wildlife host abundance, microclimatic data, vegetation, forest structure data, and weather data. And we basically ran various regression models to see if, okay, are these reductions truly because of fire, or are there other factors at play as well? So the first model that we ran was looking at total tick counts. So overall, what impacts tick abundance? And we did find when we ran that model that there was an interaction between burning and season. So what that means is essentially what we were seeing was that at our control sites that were unburned, we were seeing an abundance of ticks that were showing normal seasonality as we would expect, meaning that traditionally in the winter months, they weren't particularly active, and in the summer and spring months they were. Conversely, at our burned sites, there were no ticks there year-round. And so essentially what the model was telling us was, yes, even when accounting for all these other variables, burning does significantly reduce tick populations. The model also indicated that leaf litter cover on the ground also seemed to impact tick abundance, with areas that had more leaf litter, i.e. more than 95% leaf litter, seemed to have more ticks, specifically 2 times more ticks in those areas with high leaf litter cover. We also found that areas with high tree densities tended to have 6 times more ticks. So that was of interest to us. We then went ahead and looked at not just all ticks, we then broke it down by tick species to see if there were any sort of interesting things that emerged from that. And so we then ran a model specifically for black-legged ticks, and again, that's the vector for Lyme disease. Once again, we found that burning did significantly reduce black-legged ticks. We saw 78% reduction in our burned sites as compared to our unburned sites. We again found that high tree densities seem to be associated with more ticks, this time an even stronger relationship there with 17 times more ticks in areas with high tree densities, 17 times more black-legged ticks, I should say. And then we also found that having recent precipitation also seemed to impact the number of black-legged ticks we got, with recent precipitation being associated with 2 times more ticks. And our thinking there is that, recent precipitation is likely not associated with increased abundance, but rather increased activity. So likely the ticks are just more active after rain. So this was all really interesting to us, and one thing that immediately stood out to us was the fact that these habitat traits, the leaf litter and the high tree densities, that is associated with unburned sites, right? So if we think about sites with high leaf litter and high tree densities, inherently those are unburned sites, right? And if you have sites with little litter cover and lower tree densities, those are inherently likely sites that are managed by fire. So our question was then, okay, is it the actual fire that's driving these reductions in ticks, or is it the habitat that is somehow driving those changes that we saw in the tick population, right? So what is driving this? So we had 2 running hypotheses for what might be driving the reduction in ticks that we saw, and in particular the sustained reduction in ticks that we saw. The first hypothesis, of course, was, well, aside from fire, was the habitat that's created by fire, taking a note from our models. And then the other hypothesis was red imported fire ants. We were curious to know what, if any, role they might be playing in regulating tick populations. And you're probably scratching your head and saying, what, fire ants right about now? But what we had noticed and were aware of is that red imported fire ants, they of course are a non-native invasive species in the southeastern United States, and they are associated with disturbed habitat. They do very well in disturbed habitat, and of course burning is essentially disturbing the habitat. And what we knew just from doing field work and observation was that fire ants were quite common in burned sites, but really didn't occur at all in unburned sites. So we were curious to know if by chance the fire ants may actually be predating on ticks. So we scoured the literature a bit to see if any work had been done on that. And we indeed came across a couple papers. Unfortunately, the papers that were done were exclusively focusing on the impacts of fire ants on the Lone Star ticks, which makes sense. They're the most common tick in the Southeast, and probably considered the most, I guess, of a pest, if you will. But there were no data on any other tick species that occur in the southeastern U.S. and how fire ants may be impacting those species. But of those studies that were done, most of them were corollary and observational, and they did find that RIFA did actually predate on ticks, and did have some, in certain instances, did have significant impacts on the tick population. So that was sort of interesting to us. But with that said, there weren't many experimental studies. There weren't many manipulative studies to where we could really more definitively say, yes, fire ants are having some sort of regulatory role on tick population abundance. So with that, we set up a study, a manipulative study, to see if we could tease out the effects of both habitat and fire ants on tick population. And so to do that, we basically had 3 different treatments that we did. The first one was we had a treatment that was burned habitat with fire ants present. So again, that's naturally what occurs. We also had burned habitat without fire ants. That does not naturally occur. And so if you look at the picture in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, what you're looking at there is a picture of a fire ant exclusion area. So inside that fencing there, we actively removed and managed for removal of fire ants throughout the study. So that was a fun little adventure. The third treatment that we had was unburned habitat without fire ants. And again, that is what naturally occurs in that habitat. We chose to not have an unburned habitat with fire ants because that did not naturally occur, and that would have required us to have introduced a non-native invasive species into a habitat that it wasn't already there in. So we did not want to mess with that. So we had those 3 treatments. And within each of those treatments, we put 10 tick enclosures, which is what you're looking at on the picture on the right-hand side of your screen. That little white barrel-looking thing those were our tick enclosures. So we had 10 of those in each of our sites for our treatments. So into each of those tick enclosures, we stocked them. Yes, you can actually buy ticks. We stocked them with engorged Lone Star and Gulf Coast tick nymphs. We chose to focus on those 2 particular species because those seem to want to be the 2 species that showed very distinct preferences for burned and unburned habitat. But if any of you all are curious, I would say that certainly black-legged ticks tend to have similar preferences to Lone Star ticks and seem to respond similarly to fire. So in case you're curious about that. So the tick enclosures were stocked with those tick species during the times of year that they would normally be occurring. And then we, of course, waited. We waited for those engorged nymphs to molt and turn into adults. And after they turned into adults, we then went back and we recollected them from those enclosures and we figured out survival rates in those different treatment areas. Okay, and so here's what we found. Just to get you oriented, down on the x-axis of this graph, B stands for burned habitat, A stands for ants, i.e. fire ants were present, NA stands for no ants, and NB stands for no burning. Okay, so what do we see? Well, first off, we found there was no significant effect of fire ants on either tick species. However, if you look at our 2 bars here, maybe I don't want that there, sorry y'all, that was probably not the best. Let me see if I can get rid of that. No, I can't. So if you look at those two treatments there on the left-hand side, you can see that, let me see if I do this. I really want to get that away. No, of course it's still there. Okay, so if you look at for our Gulf Coast ticks, that's these two bars here and here, you can see in the area with ants, they're lower, right? And then if we look at our Lone Star ticks, which are here and here, once again, we see that right here, the ticks tend to be less abundant in those enclosures with ants. So while there was no statistically significant difference in abundance, we did wonder if perhaps there may be some biological significance to the roles that fire ants might be playing in regulating tick populations in those areas. Okay, the next thing we looked at was we found that Gulf Coast ticks survive significantly better in the burned habitats as compared to Lone Star ticks. So you can see the Gulf Coast ticks right here and here, right, compared to Lone Star ticks way down here in our burned treatment. They weren't doing well. So our Gulf Coast ticks were doing well, our Lone Star ticks were not doing well in those burned habitats. The other thing we found was that Lone Star ticks survive significantly better in the unburned habitat versus the burned habitat, right? So if we look at our Lone Star ticks in the unburned habitat, they're doing much better there than they were in the burned habitat treatment. So that was interesting and indeed seemed to reflect what I had seen in doing my actual work out in my 21 sites that we were working in. Okay, so what does this all mean? It does appear that the Gulf Coast ticks were better adapted to burned habitats as compared to the Lone Star ticks. And we feel that that was because of the habitat, right? We found there was no significant difference in our fire ant versus no fire ant present enclosures, indicating that the significant differences that we were seeing in survival must be tied to the habitats, the burned habitats. And I think one thing that's really important to point out here is when we were doing this particular fire ant project and working in those burned habitats, we didn't actually burn those sites while the ticks were out in those enclosures. So it's not that those ticks were having to survive fires, but rather that they were just having to survive in a burned habitat. And importantly, those habitats were not recently burned. So vegetation was alive and well in all of those habitats. So why did we see those differences in survival rates if it's tied to habitat type? Well, if you look at the pictures in this particular slide, the burned habitats that I was working in were primarily pine ecosystems, and particularly longleaf pine ecosystems, which look like something in that top picture there, which of course are associated with semi-open canopies, a lack of a mid-story, and a very dense herbaceous understory. And that's of course in direct contrast to an unburned site, such as the one you see in the bottom picture here, which has a closed canopy, a dense mid-story, and a leaf litter covered understory. So what we think was happening is that in those burned sites, because of that semi-open canopy and the lack of mid-story, you have sunlight that's able to penetrate all the way to the forest floor, which means that in those burned habitats, you are experiencing at the forest floor higher temperatures and lower humidities. Now, what kills ticks, you might ask? Well, drying out kills ticks. It turns out really the only thing that naturally kills a tick is if they dry out. And so being in a microenvironment that has higher temperatures and lower humidities is not so great for tick survival. So we really think it's that forest structure that was driving those reductions in tick populations, and very importantly, what creates that forest structure is prescribed fire. Okay, Now, I also mentioned that we looked at pathogen prevalence of these ticks that I had collected from the original 2-year project where I was sampling on a monthly basis at burned and unburned sites. So in testing those ticks, we tested them for all common tick-borne pathogens. And in general, we found that pathogen prevalence was similar to past studies that were done in other regions of Georgia and or neighboring states. In particular, I thought you all may be curious, there was no Borrelia burgdorferi in black-legged ticks. Borrelia burgdorferi is the causative agent of Lyme disease. So in other words, there's little to no risk for Lyme disease in southwestern Georgia. That's probably shocking to you all up in the Northeast. But in fact, that really was not a surprise to us and really has no link to fire at all, but it's just simply because Lyme disease is incredibly not uncommon in the southeastern United States, particularly when you get as far south as my study sites were in southwestern Georgia. So we ran some statistical analyses, and we found there was no significant differences in pathogen prevalence between burned and unburned sites. But when you take that in conjunction with the fact that we had significantly fewer ticks in those burned sites, what that means is there's a lower disease risk in areas that have been subjected to long-term prescribed fire because you have a lower density of infected ticks. So in other words, we encountered 0.02 infected ticks per hour in burn treatments or in burn sites as compared to 0.7 infected ticks per hour in our controlled unburned sites. So in other words, if you spent about an hour and a half in an unburned site, you'd probably encounter an infected tick. However, you would have to spend many hours in a burned site before you encountered an infected tick. Okay, so the take-home message is that long-term prescribed fire does significantly reduce tick populations. We observed approximately a 98% reduction in tick counts in our burn sites. When we looked further into what was actually driving that trend, we really found it was the change in vegetation structure resulting in a hotter, drier environment in those burned sites. That was what was really driving that trend. And importantly, you have to have not just a single burn, but regular long-term burning to achieve and maintain that forest structure. So overall, as I mentioned, this all adds up to a major reduction in disease risk for humans, so that's really exciting. And just as far as sort of my future work and plans, I certainly continue or plan to continue my work looking at prescribed fire and tick-borne disease risk. I know one thing that we're particularly interested in looking at and hoping to perhaps do in the next few years is that the project that I just described to you all, of course, is sort of looking at a snapshot in time at sites that have been subjected to prescribed burning for many years. So, of course, the next sort of intuitive question is, okay, well, if this is what sites look like after being burned for a number of years, how long does it take to get those results that we saw, in particular if you're wanting to use fire specifically to reduce tick populations? So one of the projects we're really hoping to find some funding for in the future is looking at fire-suppressed systems where burning hasn't been occurring but has high tick populations, and seeing if we reintroduce fire into those systems, what happens? How long does it take to get those sorts of reductions in tick populations that we saw? Okay, and with that, I just would be remiss without acknowledging the folks that helped make that research possible, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as UGA, the Jones Center, and SCWDS were responsible for funding the project. my collaborators, Michael Yabsley, Mike Connor, Michael Levin, Galina Zinstova, and Roy Burgess were really critical to the project. And then just the staff and students at the Jones Center, Squidist, and the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, as well as the private landowners, were all wonderful to work with and certainly helped tremendously. All right, so with that, I'm happy to take questions. And if for any reason we don't get to your question or you're interested in contacting me for any reason, please write down my email and feel free to shoot me an email. But meanwhile, I think we've got plenty of time for questions. So if anyone has any, feel free to, I guess, type them into the chat box there.
There's lots of questions for you, Liz, and I just want to thank you for that wonderful presentation. So informative. We'll go ahead and just start with some of the questions in the chat box. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, awesome. So Nolan Fernandez asked, have you published this work? And if not, is there any way to get a copy of your work?
Yeah, so I did publish this project in PLOS One in, I want to say it was like 2014, and that was sort of the big bulk of the work, the whole long-term prescribed fire reduces tick populations. And then we had published the fire ant project maybe a year prior to that in the Journal of Medical Entomology.
Okay.
And then
if you want to give me those links, I can put them on our website as well.
Sure. Yep, I can do that. And then as far as the pathogen testing, that is forthcoming. That is on my list as my next manuscript to get out. So
great. And then Wesley Keller was asking, what do you mean by long-term, I guess, in the prescribed fire sense?
Sure, yeah. So for us, we described long-term prescribed burning as having burned a site for a minimum of 10 years. And so given that for us, our burn cycles are typically 2 to 4 years, that meant that they had been subjected to likely at least 2 burns, if not, more. And again, a number of our sites had been burned for far longer than that, for honestly decades. But that was just sort of our cutoff for what we meant by long-term prescribed burning.
So 10 years was your cutoff? Okay, great. And then David Crary is asking, 95% leaf cover, is that on the ground leaf cover?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Litter cover, as in, litter cover on the ground.
Litter, okay. Okay, and then Troy Clymer has a question. What would be an ideal burn rotation to achieve a 98% reduction in ticks? Prescribed burn every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. So that sounds like something that you're going to be looking into in the future, is what you were mentioning.
Yeah, so the sites that we worked at, some of them were burned every 2 years, others were more like every 3 to 4 years. So that's what had been happening at those sites, and these were all, low intensity burns and that sort of thing. But I would say the biggest thing is to burn. I guess the main thing is if you're coming up with a management goal for a prescribed fire that would reduce tick populations, the biggest thing is to sort of open up the canopy a bit and sort of reduce that mid-story so that you can actually get sunlight down to the forest floor. So obviously for every system that's probably going to be different what exactly that requires. But yeah, I would say the main thing is think about the forest structure that you're trying to achieve in order to reduce the tick populations, because that seems to be what they're really responding to.
Great. So Thomas Mather was asking, what were the major types of pathogens that were detected and in which tick species?
Great question. So can I assume they can still see the PowerPoint right now?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
Okay. I am going to, let's see. Yeah, so as far as the tick-borne pathogens that we tested for the Lone Star ticks, we tested for the various types of Ehrlichia species that cause ehrlichiosis. We tested for, excuse me, I got something in my throat. As far as that southern tick-associated rash illness, the causative agent of that is still not known. There are a couple suspects, and so we tested for the suspects. And then for Gulf Coast ticks, we tested for Rickettsia parkeri, which of course is the one disease that's associated with. For the American dog tick, we tested for Rickettsia rickettsii, which causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And then for the black-legged ticks, we tested for Borrelia, of course associated with Lyme disease, as well as anaplasma, which is associated with HGA. We did not test for Babesia. So yeah, pretty much most of the common tick-borne diseases or tick-borne pathogens we were testing for. And for the most part, most tick-borne pathogens have a prevalence of usually under 3%. As far as in the southeastern U.S. and the ones that we're typically seeing there. Rickettsia parkeri typically occurs at slightly higher prevalences. Usually that's closer to, say, 10%. Prevalences that we were seeing were similar to those prevalence ranges that I just mentioned.
Okay, great. And then there's a little follow-up from David Crary. Were depth to mineral soil measured, and he's saying it might be important for mouse populations for the litter cover.
Oh, sorry. What was he asking specifically? What was measured?
If depth to mineral soil was measured.
Oh, depth to soil?
Yeah.
No. So, oh no, actually no. I'm sorry. I take that back. We did measure leaf litter depth. So yeah, we did measure that. We had thought about earlier on when we were first sort of developing the project whether or not we wanted to actually trap small mammals and include that as part of our project. Unfortunately, in terms of resources, we just didn't have the time and resources to do that. But for us, because Lyme disease doesn't really occur in southwestern Georgia, we felt okay kind of dropping that piece of the project. We also, a number of my sites were located at the Jones Ecological Research Center, and it's a fairly large active research center down there, and they have a wildlife lab there who traps small mammals on a regular basis. And in talking to them and going out with them a little bit earlier on in the project, they weren't really seeing ticks on the small mammals there. And of course, that was only a portion of our sites. But
okay. Yeah.
So all those things put together, we really felt like when we were trying to prioritize where we were going to put our time into, we kind of ended up dropping the small mammal piece. But I certainly agree that if we were to do that project here in Virginia or somewhere further up in the Northeast, you would be remiss not to involve the small mammals.
Right. Okay. And then Nia Becker has a question. Are there any unintended consequences of increased burning? So does it increase the abundance of other arthropods?
Good question. Not to my knowledge, although of course we weren't monitoring other arthropods in the project. What little research I've come across, and again, I haven't actively looked for it, but it's just been stuff I've happened to notice here and there. It doesn't seem like it's negatively impacting, in particular, I guess, arthropods that would be vectors of disease or something of that nature.
Okay. Ian Biazzo has a question. Were the burns done during the same season in a year? Would you suspect differences based on burn season?
Good question. Yeah, that's a question that we've been really curious about ourselves. because I told the land managers to essentially act like I wasn't there and just do the burns whenever they would normally be doing them. For us in South Georgia, the burn season's fairly long compared to probably what you all are doing in the Northeast. Typically, burning is starting in early to mid-fall and runs through March to April. So the burns were happening sort of randomly throughout the burn season, but so there was no real way to tease out whether burn season had any impact, particularly because the ticks just weren't there to begin with.
Right.
But that's definitely a question that we've had is, does burn season make a difference? And in particular, would a growing season burn versus a dormant season burn, does that make any difference? Because, of course, the ticks are active during the growing season, and for the most part, it's a very gross overgeneralization, but you're certainly going to have more ticks that are sort of quiescent down in the leaf litter in the winter months. So, how that might affect the tick populations is definitely a future potential research project we've talked about.
Right. Nia has another question. Are there methods other than fire that can simulate the changes in forest structure, I'm assuming to have the same effect on ticks?
Yeah, there have been some studies that have looked at things like herbicide applications and things like that with some varying levels of success. I think it would probably, and this is speculation because it's been a while since I've looked at those studies, but I would certainly think it would be better than not burning. Whether you would get quite the results that you see from burning, I think is probably questionable, but I don't know. I mean, if you could kind of open up the canopy a little bit and take out that mid-story, then it seems plausible that, potentially you would be seeing reductions in tick populations. But again, I can't point to a specific study that's done that before.
Okay. Yeah, so Karen had a very similar question, which I think if it wasn't answered, Karen, please write a follow-up, please. And let's see. We have another question. One, were you able to confirm that the fire ants could get in and out of tick enclosures? And two, did you collect microclimate data in burned versus unburned sites?
Yes. So for the fire ant question, yeah, we did confirm that the fire ants could get into the enclosures. So throughout the project, we would basically put bait, if you will, for fire ants in the enclosures to confirm that they were indeed able to access them, and they were. And then for microclimate data. Yeah, the microclimate data was included in those models that we ran. So yeah, that was I guess accounted for. Yeah.
Okay. I think we've addressed the. Well, it says, what is the definition of dormant season and growing season, and do you think growing season will produce much different results? So we did address some of the seasonality. That's still a question that you are interested in addressing in the future.
Yeah. So dormant season burn would just be burning when the leaves are not on the vegetation. So in Georgia, that was, fall through, March or so. Growing season burn would be essentially with leaf on, so, spring, summer burns essentially.
Okay, Carla is wondering, how did you eliminate fire ants in your one study area? What insecticide did you use?
Great question. We actually could not use insecticides because we didn't want to affect ticks, or there were other ongoing research projects that were happening in there with wildlife and things, so we couldn't use insecticides. So actually what we ended up doing was, in working with a fire ant biologist, he recommends that we boil them essentially. So we created this contraption that we could haul out into the woods and boil water in, and then we would basically just jam a rod down the colonies and pour the boiling water over them. Yeah.
Cool.
So it was a process.
Nolan's wondering, have you done any burn studies on islands? If so, do you think over time you can knock down the population that it won't recover? I guess that would be similar to your island of unburned.
Yeah. I've not personally done any projects on islands. I would love to do a project on an island, though. If anyone has any potential sites, let me know, because that would be awesome. I think just given the general concepts of island biology, I would think if anywhere had a chance of knocking tick populations down, it would be on an island, particularly if you could control hosts coming in and off of the island. So yeah.
But did you see, just to follow up, did you see any difference in the unburned sort of island of that you had surrounded by burned compared to some of the other treatments?
Yeah, so that was one thing that was really fascinating to us that I think kind of got buried in a lot of the information from that project, was that even in locations that were unburned but directly surrounded by burned areas, we still were not finding ticks. And on the flip side of that, unburned areas surrounded by burned areas were also tickless. So what it seems to indicate is that, the burns are not only impacting the actual areas that are getting burned, but they seem to also be impacting areas immediately surrounding that. Now, how far those effects go into those unburned areas, we don't know, and that's yet again another really great project that might happen down the road. But
so like
we thought that was interesting. Yeah, sort of edge effects, or if you think about, if you have a burned site, what's your source population of ticks that are going to repopulate the area? Well, they're going to be coming from unburned areas. So is it that those source populations are essentially getting depleted over time? That's resulting in sort of what we were seeing there. But that was definitely really interesting to us.
Great. So Matt Dickinson was trying to, I think, specify, but he said the direct effect, was it the direct effect of fires killing the ticks outright, or the habitat situation, or maybe a combination of both that really knocked the ticks down?
Yeah, good question. So, in doing the fire ant project, that was one way that we attempted to tease out what's fire and what's the habitat. And so the fact that we were seeing significant reductions in survival in the burned habitat seems to indicate that it's primarily the habitat that's driving that. But I think, it's undeniable that fire kills ticks. So certainly I would say that's probably sort of an additive effect. But I think the difference is if you just had a single burn and it wasn't enough to really change the forest structure, I think the ticks would just rebound and come back to pre-burn levels. But to see those sustained reductions that we saw, I think you've really got to change the habitat, the forest structure itself.
Okay. I'm going to skip down to Carla. When you spoke about tree density in general, what type were you speaking of? Was it pines only, mixed pine and hardwoods, or hardwoods only?
So we, tree density, we did basically like a point center quarter survey of trees. So it was, all, trees in the plot, essentially, whatever was closest to the, the points within the plot. So yeah, it could have been any tree species, essentially. And I'd have to go. I'm going to say it was around 10 centimeters CBH or higher, but don't quote me on that. You'll have to check the paper because it's been a while. But yeah.
Okay. Well, I know we're sort of at the top of the hour here, a minute after, but I just wanted to thank everyone for tuning in and thank Dr. Gleim. And just remind everyone that we will have this video on our website probably in about a week or so. But if we have time, we can continue going down the chat box for a few more minutes. But just wanted to thank you before everyone signed off.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay on for a little bit if other folks still have questions.
Okay, great. We'll just keep moving down. So Judy says, was there a shrub understory in the heavy tree areas? So I'm not exactly sure which treatment she's referring to. Maybe the unburned?
Yeah, I'm guessing she's talking about the unburned. There was definitely a dense mid-story as far as shrubbiness. I mean, there were certainly shrubby areas, if you will, but as far as like if you're thinking about ability to travel through the sites, I mean, it was mostly, the mid-story was mostly comprised of, you know, either young saplings or smaller trees and things like that. But there certainly were some shrubby patches within those areas.
Okay. So Nia's asking, where do ticks actually lay their eggs?
Excuse me. Excellent question. They tend to lay their eggs in the leaf litter. Yeah, so the female, the engorged female will drop off of a wildlife host after feeding, and then once she's back in the leaf litter there, she'll lay the eggs.
Joel is saying we have several in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. I think he's talking about islands. They have several islands in Massachusetts and Rhode Island that they're burning on this spring. So I will get you Joel's contact number.
That would be excellent. I'd love to hear from you, Joel.
Okay, and then Paula is saying it might be worth looking at Cuttyhunk Island, which I'm unsure of where that is personally, but yeah, you can contact Paula as well.
Okay.
And then Moses is talking about any deer density numbers available for that study.
Yeah, so we did trail camera surveys to look at host abundance for our particular project, and I unfortunately can't quote off the top of my head what those deer densities were. I can tell you they certainly, I know this is probably quite vague, but I would say they were low to moderate densities, definitely nowhere near overpopulated, if that's what maybe he was wondering.
I'm sure that helps. Okay, so Carla is saying after a burn and reduction of ticks, how long does it take for them to rebound to pre-burn numbers? And so that, again, I think is something that you're going to be looking into in the future, correct?
Yeah, so I can tell you from, again, in our project, they weren't rebounding. They were just flatlined. They just weren't there. But in other studies that have seen rebounds, I would say the general, most studies are finding that they're kind of rebounding within a year.
Oh, okay. So that's pretty quick. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. And then Sarah is saying that they burn on Nantucket Island. So here's another candidate for you. If the forest disturbance isn't significant enough to change the forest structure and allow more sunlight to hit the ground, how long does it take for the tick population to rebound? Okay, again, that's a similar question.
Yeah, I'd say about a year.
Okay. And then Matt Dickinson is saying, any reason to think that Ixodes ticks are less tolerant of burned habitats than other tick species?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it seemed like the black-legged ticks were trending more closely with the Lone Star ticks and how they were responding to fire. Maybe slightly less so than the Lone Star ticks. But I guess in short, the Lone Star ticks being very sensitive to fire, I would say the black-legged ticks are probably not quite as sensitive, but still significantly impacted by it. whereas the Gulf Coast ticks seem to be almost adapted to the fire in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would say things are looking up for, I would say things are looking up if you're hoping to control black-legged ticks with fire. It does seem like they are affected by it, so.
Okay, all right. And then it sounds like we're kind of winding up here. If anyone else has any questions that they want Dr. Gleim to answer, now's the time. So we'll give you a couple more minutes here to think about it. But thank you so much, Liz, for doing this. And of course, what comes to my mind is like, all of the relationships we have from your study down in Georgia to our Northeast region here. And, I mean, the ticks up here are insane. So, we would just absolutely love it if you could pursue some of those contacts and your research up here as well. So,
I would love that.
Okay, great. So, I don't see any more questions in the chat box, so I'm going to go ahead and say that we're going to be wrapping it up here. Do you have any other comments, Liz?
No, I don't think so. Just thanks for joining us. And again, if anyone has any questions or if you have any, cool sites that you think might be of interest, please certainly feel free to contact me. There's my email address, and of course this will be, I assume, posted online soon, so you can grab it there too.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.